Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt, editor at Third Sector.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse, multimedia reporter. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And this week is a special edition as we recorded it at the Third Sector conference, which was held this week at the Barbican Centre in London. And we're going to go straight across to it now.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Third Sector podcast, which is coming to you live from the Third Sector conference at the Barbican Centre in London.
We're here to talk about another podcast. 2024 has been a very exciting year for Third Sector's podcast offering in that we produced our first ever podcast documentary, The End of Charity. Perhaps we can just give a very brief synopsis of what The End of Charity is about. It is something of an ominous title, I grant you that. But really it was asking some big questions about where the sector has come from and what the future of the charity sector is, and whether in its current form, the current charity model is really fit for purpose to solve the problems in today's society. And if not, what might some of the alternatives be?
Absolutely. It covered a huge range of topics over a 6-episode limited series. We looked at the food bank culture in this country. We looked at the rise of YouTube philanthropy, which is actually something that came up earlier in this conference today. We looked at the groups that charities are currently missing with their models, the complex relationship between the sector and government. And we were sort of asking, well, what does a world look like if we're moving to a place where charity is actually winding down? So it's brilliant to have this space carved out for us at the end of the conference to explore just some of those themes that we were looking at in the podcast, and also actually having a live audience within arm's reach as well. One of the hardest things about podcasting is that you are effectively speaking into a void. So we're really hoping to make use of the verbal and the non-verbal feedback that you can give us this afternoon. If you have a question, we're really going to actively encourage you to stick your hand up and speak to us through a roving mic. This is Sharif down here. He's got the roving mic, and we'll be pausing for audience questions throughout this session.
We are delighted to be joined on stage as well by Rhodri Davies, who is the founder and director of Why Philanthropy Matters. So he's a philanthropy expert. He is also a podcaster in his own right, and he was one of the key voices in The End of Charity, helping us to make sense of some of these big issues that we were covering. So hi, Rhodri. Great to have you with us.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
So to start off, I'm going to play a very brief clip. It's the beginning of our second episode, which is entitled, Can MrBeast Save Humanity? Imagine a world far from your own, which is full of problems.
6 months ago, this orphanage in South Africa looked like this. And despite having saved more than 5,000 children's lives over time, it was about to get shut down.
But armed with a big wad of cash, you can go and solve whichever issue takes your fancy.
When hearing about this, we made it our mission to ensure this doesn't happen by rebuilding 12 new homes with an ongoing supply of fresh food, as well as a brand new playground.
From helping orphan children in South Africa to solving the conundrum of safe drinking water.
You just witnessed a small village in Kenya get access to unlimited clean drinking water in less than a second. One down, 99 more wells in Africa to go.
It would feel great, wouldn't it? But if you work for a charity, you'll know that doesn't happen easily. Raising funds is a full-time job in itself, and how you spend your donors' money is also quite rightly scrutinised. But Jimmy Donaldson, an online megastar from North Carolina, has created a world where he can do just that.
Thank goodness Jimmy has the heart that he has, because he looked at what he's achieved and he's like, I've got all of this influence, I've got all of this fame, and I've got all of this wealth, and I want to do something meaningful with it.
You're listening to The End of Charity. I'm Lucinda Rouse, and in this series, we ask whether the traditional concept of charity has had its day. So there we have a sneak preview for you. And if anybody is not familiar with the online sensation that is MrBeast, I'll just give you some very brief top line figures. So MrBeast is a 26-year-old content creator. He is the biggest YouTuber, and he has, as I checked this morning, 284 million subscribers to his channel, and his videos have accumulated 45 billion views. And the reason that we were interested to explore this new phenomenon was because he has branched out into the world of philanthropy, and he has mixed up performing stunts such as filling houses with Lego bricks and all the rest of it with doing good, helping somebody, paying $10,000 to a homeless person and then filming it. But there are also some questions around whether or not this way of doing good is problematic. And Rhodri, you are something of an expert in this. I know you've just had a journal article published on it recently, and we were delighted to get your thoughts in the podcast. And first of all, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the moral responsibility and the problematic nature of this form of philanthropy through influencers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lucinda. As you say, I recently did, I wrote it a while ago, but I had an article that came out in the Journal of Philanthropy and Marketing back in March about MrBeast and trying to understand and assess his philanthropy, which then had a few responses from other academics doing comments on it, which was really interesting from a range of perspectives. I think the thing about MrBeast that I've found fascinating since I first latched onto him as a phenomenon in philanthropy is that I assumed I was going to hate him and think he was just a pure force for evil because there's something grating about the aesthetics of what he does. And I guess I first came across it when my kids made me watch some of his videos. But actually, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, I'm conflicted here. I mean, there is stuff about it that I think is problematic and worrying, but I think there's also some stuff about it that actually you can question whether, potentially is a force for good, or, even if he himself isn't necessarily the force for good, is paving a way for something that is going to influence charity in a positive way in the future, because he does wield an enormous amount of influence with an audience that I think most charities would absolutely give their right hands and legs to be able to tap into effectively. And, in order to do that, he uses kind of tools of content creation and, aesthetics and editing that mean that the content sometimes, always is highly sensationalized. And, the problem with that is that then when you are depicting issues of disability or poverty, particularly in contexts in, the global south, that can be extremely uncomfortable. But then the flip side is he's getting an audience that might never have even stopped to think about, the responsibilities to give to charity and the work that charities do to really engage with it. And also he is getting an audience to watch content about charity and philanthropy when they could be watching content about a whole lot of other things on the internet that would be, a lot less positive. So I'm very conflicted about him. And I think the more that you sort of genuinely engage with what he's doing, you have to take quite a nuanced view of it.
Absolutely. And I think, with the rise of kind of gaming and Twitch and streaming for good and stuff like that, influencers like MrBeast are becoming a really core tool that charities could actually use. Now, of course, one of the things that MrBeast does is he kind of tries to bypass that charity partnership model, and he is doing what he considers kind of direct philanthropy and direct altruism. I take your point as well that in that he is reaching a young base of people who are preteen and teenagers and starting to engage them with those ideas of what it is to give to charity. And his arguments and his programs are hyper simplistic. There's very little nuance to them. But I think a part of that is because he's talking to 11-year-olds. That is something that a lot of charities, that's an audience they're not necessarily connecting with yet. But I think another thing is that in this space, there is very little regulation of this kind of content. There's no charity commission for the YouTube influencer. And so they have the kind of a free reign to really do whatever they like and position that. I wonder, do you think in the future we see a need for kind of a greater regulation of this kind of influencer philanthropy?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you said there's no regulation in this space. My initial thought was, do you mean philanthropy or do you mean YouTube influencing? Because I guess, to some extent there's little or no regulation of what individuals do when it comes to their giving, even people with large amounts of money, except insofar as they then set up vehicles that have a legal form that means that they do become regulated, or they're using media in such a way that they become regulated by another body. So I think in that sense, it's potentially unfair to hold influencers like MrBeast to a higher standard than all of the rest of philanthropy. And actually, when I was thinking about this on the way here, I was thinking, in a way, one of the things that we at the moment often demand of philanthropists and funders is that they're more transparent. And we don't necessarily know all the details of what people like MrBeast are doing, but he's making videos about it and telling us. So to some extent, there's quite a high degree of transparency in that. And actually, in the future, it could pave the way for vastly heightened levels of transparency about how funding is done and kind of where it's going. I guess the other bit is maybe he's just the tip of a much bigger iceberg, in that he is an influencer and a celebrity and represents the ability to tap into a huge audience. But that bit of the narrative that he's pushing that you alluded to there about doing it in a way that bypasses traditional charities is really interesting, because is he just tapping into something that is already there anyway, or there's a sort of groundswell of interest in? Because there's a lot of giving, that's already taking the form of things like crowdfunding or giving directly to unregistered groups or even to individuals on payment platforms and social media around things like fundraising for individual medical care and that kind of thing. And what is it that's driving that? And is MrBeast just a reflection of the fact that that is meeting an appetite that's already out there? Or is he pushing a narrative further that, will result in younger people particularly maybe being motivated to do good, but when they do, thinking that they, aren't even going to start by engaging with charities?
Yeah, I mean, it's his platform, isn't it, that makes him so compelling, and probably for charities who perhaps want to engage with him and get on his platform. I know in the series we interviewed Darren Margolius, who is the executive director of Beast Philanthropy, which manages MrBeast's philanthropy arm. And he said that they get so many approaches from charities wanting to be a part of it. But his message is really, don't do good through a charity. Do it yourself. You get so much more out of directly helping somebody, and it's trying to get that connection, which is all very well and good. And some people have questioned his intentions in terms of philanthrocapitalism and quite what he's trying to get out of doing these good deeds. But I think even if you do take it at face value, this is a young man, 26 years old, who has a lot of money and a lot of fame, and he wants to do something positive with it. But there is that big responsibility there in terms of how you deliver the charitable endeavor, how you help people. And yeah, it brings up all kinds of issues of power and the imbalance between the person who has the power and coming in and building wells for children in Africa. So perhaps there is a need for more structure and more regulation around this form of doing good. And I wondered, Rhodri, if you could tell us a bit about what's happening in China, because I understand obviously a highly regulated environment, but influencer philanthropy is quite a big thing there as well.
Yeah, it is. And it was interesting. It's one of the things I learned through one of the responses to the article I did, where a couple of academics who had more expertise in the Chinese philanthropy context wrote a response saying, actually, this is all interesting and right about MrBeast, but it doesn't necessarily apply that well to the context in China, where social media influence philanthropy is huge, but perhaps not as apparent to us because it's happening on platforms that we usually don't have access to, like Weibo and others and Bilibili. But saying there, as with a lot of other philanthropy that's taking place in China, the government of China is actually hugely positive about philanthropy, but in a way where only insofar as it is very clearly aligned with governmental priorities and policy aims. And when it comes to influencer philanthropy, that means that what influencers themselves do is quite highly regulated by rules that govern the sorts of content that can be provided. It has to be seen as wholesome and in line with sort of the priorities and views that the Chinese government wants to promote. and also insofar as, their aims for philanthropy are in line with their views about what charity should be. And understandably, that tends to mean things that are more to do with directly addressing needs and less to do with challenging government policy around human rights, for instance. So in a way, more tightly controlling influence of philanthropy, maybe there is something to learn about the positive side to that. But then obviously you have to then question what power is placed in the hands of government then to dictate, philanthropists, including influence philanthropists, are able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if now might be a moment to open very briefly to the floor before we move on to the next section. And I wonder if anybody has any questions for Rhodri or any comments on influence of philanthropy and how charities can get involved, and perhaps anyone have experiences to share of it. I think we've got somebody up there towards the back.
Hey, so my name's George from the Directory of Social Change, and seeing a lot of organisations moving to different social media platforms, younger social media platforms. Seen a lot of success with organisations with Twitch. And I was wondering if you would recommend, if a charity sat there wondering where to go, if there was one you would get to focus on.
I'm 42. I don't know what everybody's asking me. I don't know that. I mean, my thing is not practical advice about how best to go about social media strategy. But I do think, I agree. I think it's really interesting that charities are thinking about how to use some of these platforms to get their message out and to engage with different audiences. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, as Emily says, it's not just that you're then using different tools to get to the same audience in different ways, but particularly if you're using platforms like Twitch that get you into entire new communities based more around, kind of gaming and that sort of thing. Actually, there's a growing body of evidence that those are very kind of fertile grounds on which to kind of tap into new audiences for fundraising and donations. I guess the challenge, and this goes to something you were saying there, Lucinda, is you can absolutely imagine the circumstances in which, a relatively sort of traditional charity sees this stuff and just does it in the wrong way. And it's absolutely cringeworthy because you come in, I can imagine a charity being like, oh, let's make our own MrBeast video, and not realizing that actually what he does is incredibly finely honed. And whether you like it or not, he's absolutely brilliant at what he does. If you've ever listened to MrBeast talk about his process, those videos cost a vast amount of money. They go through about 200 iterations, each one of them. The amount of time that he spent thinking about the exact way in which the thumbnails for each video look and that kind of thing, none of it is accidental. And so actually kind of assuming that you could just kind of, bumble along and replicate this stuff effectively, I think you'd be misguided. So you have to go into it with your eyes open. But as long as it's done on that basis and kind of done in a way that engages with the users of those platforms, absolutely.
I think there is absolutely a content lesson to be taken here, and setting aside, and we talk in this episode quite a lot about the problematic optics of MrBeast's videos. But I remember something that struck me is when we were recording this at the time, the latest Comic Relief telethon had come out, and the on-the-night viewing figures for Comic Relief this year, off the top of my head, I think it was around 35 million people tuned in on the night. And the next day we were talking about MrBeast. I was looking at that 10-minute video that he had done, which was we're building 100 wells in Africa or something along those lines. It was 10 minutes of content. It had 250 million views and counting all the time. And so there is a really fertile space for this. What I would also say as well is that there are some charities doing unbelievable things in new social media spaces and building really new, vibrant, young audiences. Off the top of my head, British Red Cross is doing amazing things on TikTok. They've reached a new audience there. And my absolute favorite charity at the moment in the TikTok space is the RSPB.
I was going to say.
I don't know if anyone has looked at it. It is unhinged content, like absolutely bonkers stuff. I don't know who is on their team, but it is working, and they are racking up tens of thousands of views with 30-second videos, which is like how many species of birds can we count in this time. And this may not necessarily be directly translating into fundraising, but what it is doing is it is fostering a really new young audience who then may be at the beginning of a very, very long and sustained supporter journey. How you get that right, it's a fine art. There are some amazing digital experts in the sector who could give some insights on that. Maybe we'll bring them in next year. But it's definitely a space that can be tapped into.
Hi, Ed Sutcliffe from the NSPCC. I just wonder whether this might be the shock of the new, that we, having worked in charities for a long time, see this new disruptive way of doing things as just different and wrong. And I wonder how you might compare it if you could think back to how maybe the leadership of Oxfam might have thought when some pop stars decided to solve the problems of Africa back in 1985. And maybe they would also point out the long-term issues that are underlying all that activity, which wasn't really being mentioned on the stage.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted you said that, because one of the recurring themes of the journal article I wrote was actually how much of this is genuinely new. And I think you're right. The whole idea of celebrity philanthropy is definitely not something that MrBeast has created. And the idea of philanthropy as content isn't necessarily new. Well, actually, that's not quite right. I think the idea of charities harnessing content and entertainment in order to raise awareness and funds is not new. One of the things that maybe is potentially genuinely new about MrBeast in particular is the economic model that he's using because of the way that YouTube works, whereas he is able to say to his audience, it's not like Comic Relief, it's not, please, watch this serious-minded video about the work that we're doing, then watch this hilarious sketch, and then, we'll have a fundraising ask. He is saying to them, I'm showing you this video that is in itself entertaining, in which I do a philanthropic act, and you as a viewer, well, you've already done your bit, because by watching it, I get money through the AdSense algorithm, and therefore the machine feeds itself. So actually, he isn't asking for money. That being said, he has actually now moved on quite recently to start asking in a more traditional way for money. So maybe he's learned something and is, kind of evolving, and will come back to a model that looks much more like the traditional telethon. But I think there are elements of it that are potentially quite novel. But again, you're right. We always need to not get carried away by the shiny and the new, and kind of maybe take a step back a bit.
I think we'll move on to another theme now that we covered in the End of Charity documentary, and that is the issue of power. And our episode focusing on power was called Power in the Wrong Hands. We spent a lot of time thinking about who holds the money in the voluntary sector, who decides how it's spent and who benefits from it, where that's come from, and perhaps how that needs to be readjusted to make philanthropy, charity, fit for purpose in today's society. And I'd like to play another clip from the series. And we're going to hear just a few seconds from Chilande Kuloba-Warria, who is the founder and director of Warande Advisory Centre, which is based in Kenya. But she and her colleagues provide technical assistance to NGOs and civil society organisations all around the world.
Every time I wake up, I've got projects I'm running in Bangladesh. I do understand that I have to take some time to prove my worth a lot more than my white counterparts would, that they can receive me. So those things are still there. And so we still need to put more effort in changing narratives, depicting differences, diversity of our people, in order for us to get to that space where it doesn't matter. My fear is that this becomes another fad. I hope this is not just another fashionable thing that we are discussing right now, because human beings, sometimes we have short memories. Right now, we want to do this, and I'm hoping that people don't get tired of questioning, of having conversations. I'm liking the direction. I'm liking the introspection. I still think we need to go a little bit deeper in having the uncomfortable conversations.
So, there, Chilande was talking about progress in how power is structured, how stories are told about charitable work. This is obviously a very hot topic. It's something that has been covered in a number of the sessions today. But it's a really difficult time, and charities have got so many different competing priorities, and often budgets are being slashed, staff numbers are getting lower and lower. And so what I'd like to ask now is how charities can sustain the momentum in tackling social injustices, which includes and is baked into the very way that the charity sector is structured, to make sure that we carry on having these difficult conversations around power, and particularly for charities where it goes beyond the bounds of their cause areas, where they might not specifically be tackling social injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that there is just a practical challenge in that I think we all know the situation economically is very difficult for lots of organizations. And before we recorded the series last year, and certainly since, there have been many stories of charities, facing extraordinary difficulties and even having to close. So I don't think, we should be naive at all about those practical difficulties. I guess it is also important that for the talk about genuinely addressing some of the imbalances of power in the sector, and also historic racial injustices and the way in which marginalized communities have been sort of excluded from power and decision making, that stuff can't be a luxury that only happens when everybody's got everything else sorted. It does have to be embedded in everything that organizations are doing. And I say that still not pretending for a second that means that it is easy. The process of genuinely trying to engage with power and to try and get participation from groups with lived experience who previously maybe haven't been involved in decision making is worthwhile. But again, it's not always easy. It requires quite a lot of work. So I think, organizations need to be aware of that. But it's not, I don't think it is a job that can be shirked, apart from anything else, as we were seeing before, in a context where potentially there are a growing number of alternatives that are out there for people when they look up and think, right, well, I want to achieve some sort of change in the world. What am I going to do? If traditionally they might have thought, well, that means, giving to a charity or engaging with a charity, now they'll look up and they'll see all kinds of things out there. They'll see new digital social movements out there telling them that they can achieve change much more radically and much more quickly. They'll see businesses telling them that actually they've got a social purpose. So if you just, shop with us or work for us, that will achieve change in the world. And I think in that context, charities need to be much more clear about what unique value they bring in terms of, the model that they use. And if there are failings in that model in terms of it, creating or perpetuating power imbalances, they need to be addressed, because otherwise people will understandably look elsewhere, I think.
So, Rhodri, we spoke about 7 months ago now. I think we recorded the interview for The End of Charity. The documentary came out in March, so 3 months ago. What's changed since we were on mic the last time?
It's been quite quiet, hasn't it? A lot has changed, and in some ways a lot has stayed the same. I think a lot of the challenges that we were talking about, food poverty and unfortunately hugely rising numbers of people having to use food banks, and the quite fundamental questions that throws up about what it is that charities are there to do, and whether, even if they recognise that there is acute need, whether in meeting that acute need, they are also able to focus resources on addressing the underlying causes of that need, or indeed whether sometimes in addressing acute needs, they are potentially making themselves part of the problem, in that they are kind of undermining some of the momentum for that. And I guess that brings us to the political context, where the big thing that has changed, surprisingly for pretty much everybody, is that we're now in the run-up to a general election. I suppose we knew that was going to happen at some point before January next year, but that could, I don't want to overstate it, because I think it could change things quite dramatically in terms of narrative and framing. I think some of the political and economic challenges mean that in reality it's not as though suddenly everything's going to be magically better. I think even if there is a change of government, and that brings with it entire new personnel and policy directions, the reality for a lot of organizations will be at a local level. Local authorities are still struggling enormously with their budgets and having to look to make cuts. At a national level, there's still very difficult economic challenges. There will still be lots of issues around poverty. The NHS needs vastly more investment, and many other areas. So this stuff is not going to happen quickly, but I guess, charities might hope that they will be in a position to influence thinking in different directions, and so that might open up more space to refresh some of their campaigning and advocacy work. and they might hope that they might be able to reset some of the relationships that they have in terms of delivering services at a local and national level. So, let's be optimistic.
So I think it might be worth just opening for audience questions again. If there is anything else you would like to put to Rhodri on the topics that we've just discussed, I'm looking for hands.
Hi there, Tim Baker from Shelter. Some of the stuff we've been trying to do at Shelter about getting people with lived experience involved in the storytelling, decision making we're doing. Just wonder, under that kind of title of the end of charity, whether sort of to what extent you see that as our ability to continue, the continuation of charity is the extent to which we're able to shift the power to decentralize, delocalize, and invest in that kind of local community-led sector that might just kind of change the way we think about charity.
I think it's an important part of it, in that if there are questions about the fundamental legitimacy of organisations and the whole model of charity, a big part of the answer probably does come from finding ways to move power as well as financial resources. And part of that then is about thinking about who gets to make the decisions about what it is that is done and how resources are allocated. And that does require often quite radically different ways of doing things, because a lot of the models of charity that we have historically are ones that stem from the idea that actually the important thing to do was for those who were in ownership and control of resources to make decisions about who was most deserving or undeserving to be the recipients of those resources. And obviously, we've kind of softened that narrative over time and it's evolved, but it's still kind of there in the DNA of the idea of charities as organisations. And you have to do quite a lot of active work, I think, to overcome that. I think that the really interesting thing is that sometimes it's presented as if, it is either, well, don't do anything, or, it's the end of charity and you put yourself out of business. Whereas the reality for when it comes to participation and power shifting is that it's really a spectrum where, your end goal might be to shift power and allow participation so much that essentially you are almost redundant as an organisation, and you might be delighted about that. But that doesn't have to be the starting point. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the end point, because I can think of many areas of work in which actually what's required is a balance between lived experience, expertise of people working in charities, expertise of, academics and medical professionals, and finding ways to allow different forms of knowledge to coexist and be valued equally. I think that's the really kind of fertile ground. So it's more about shifting along that spectrum rather than having to go from zero to the other end of it.
Hi, Nick Owen from the Mighty Creatives. I just wanted to say, if we'd been able to meet and hear from the voices of the people we work for on behalf of with today, I think we would have turned that statement, the end of charity, which looks like a kind of full stop at the end of it, into a kind of question mark. Because actually there is so much fantastic work going on, and all we have to do is listen to the people we're working with to know the effect we are making on a daily basis. And I think if we lose sight of the people we are with and for, then that is the end of charity, and then it is a full stop. But it's not, it's a question mark.
Thank you very much. And across the series, we had a lot of kind of different models and alternatives to charity model. We had an episode that focused on mutual aid, on local community groups. We had a lot of small charities talking about their experiences in the space as well. Obviously, it's very hard to do that in a small session like this, but I absolutely agree. And I think the lived experience piece, which a lot of organizations are working on and building right now, when that's being done meaningfully, that is one of the most important things that charities can be doing right now. And organizations like Freedom from Torture are making amazing kind of strides in this space, and you can really see the difference in how their practice is being influenced by those people. And I think that is a massive part of that power shift. Absolutely.
And I'd just say I really love your point, because I agree. To me, there is a question mark there. It's not on the poster, but it's definitely there when you read it. And it's because even in that context where we're asking difficult questions about the current models of charity we have and whether there are alternatives and whether we need to change them, I think the answer to that is not, we need to get rid of charity. All of us work in the charity sector, and we know from the things that we're seeing and doing every day that there is huge value in that work and in the work that people and lots of other organizations are doing. I think to me, the key thing is, how do we be more clear about what that value is, and not just assume that it is clear to everyone, both within the sector and beyond it. Because I think that's the challenge, is in some parts of the public, increasingly, they're not that clear about what charities are and what they do and what function and role they serve in society, or they might have concerns about the way in which it's done. So if we can answer those concerns and make that positive case for why there is still something fundamentally important about the charity and the idea of giving things away with no expectation of return, whether that's your time or your money, in the modern day, then I think that's the answer that we need. And I think there is that answer to be found. We just need to make sure that we clarify what it is.
Stay tuned for series 2. We've reached the end of this session. Please do listen to the end of Charity if we haven't completely put you off over the past 40 minutes. Thank you very much, Rhodri, for your time, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
That was myself and Lucinda recording live there from the Barbican Centre in London. I'd like to say a massive thank you to our guest, Rhodri Davies, to everybody who listened live on the day, and of course to our producer, Nav Powell. Just a reminder that if you are listening to the recorded version of this and you'd like to get in touch, our listeners' survey is always open. Your feedback really does mean a lot to us, and we want to know what you think. As ever, you can find the link to our online survey in the show notes of every episode.